So I've introduced systems thinking when it comes to churches, what I use as an STM, what I was trained to use, and I find effective. Understanding everything as a web, not as singular cause and effect. Understanding the church to be a living organism, not a machine. And this video now will describe the first of the four categories, the smallest, in terms of size dynamics and how it affects mostly the role of the pastor. So these churches have fewer than 50 active members, and they function very much like a family or an extended family. This means they have a mom and or dad figure who directs everything. A matriarch or patriarch is some older language that we used for that. Or, in more current language, a key person of influence. The pastor, this is key, especially for pastors to know, the pastor is not the center. The pastor is to be the one who serves and does not really lead. Such congregations do not really want leadership from the pastor, or certainly the matriarch or patriarch will not. What this kind of church wants is pastoral care, period. Meaning having someone in the house, so to speak, who can baptize them and marry and bury them, and when there's trouble, reassure them that all is going to be okay and pray for them when they are troubled. The church family can be dysfunctional or functional. So in other words, if the relationships are functional and the matriarch or patriarch is a true servant leader who hands their agenda over to Jesus, then it can be functional. It can be really good, just like in any real family. But it can also be dysfunctional. In one church that I worked with at arm's length, I worked with the pastor who was there. Together we discovered that the patriarch was a person who was no longer attending that church. It was a small family-sized church, has had troubles throughout its history, but the patriarch had quit attending, but three of members of his extended family, so his, like maybe let's just say one of his kids and two of his in-law kids, were on the leadership team of that church. And they were also a family that each Sunday met for lunch at the patriarch's home. And so what this pastor was experiencing was that decisions would get made by the leadership team, and then at the next meeting, 2 or 3 people would come back and want to rescind the decision and have some reasons for why that should be so. If you just heard a funny sound, my dog is sneezing right here. And so that was the dynamic. And they would have a family gathering. The patriarch would say, well, that's a ridiculous thing to do, blah, blah, we've never done it that way, blah, 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 and maybe even have some decent reasons. And the children then would be kind of shocked that they made such a dumb decision, and so they would feel compelled to come back and undo it. And this went on repeatedly. So that's one example of how it can work. And that was a dysfunctional situation, and the pastor couldn't get anywhere. The central figure, the key influencer, sees to it that the pastor does not succeed in making drastic change. The pastor is presumed to be temporary. The key influencer is not going anywhere. And so this pattern is particularly true in rural communities, and it maybe even can go, I haven't seen this, so I'm speculating, from generation to generation in a particular family. But the pastors, well, they come and go. They come with all their funny ideas out of seminary, and then they move on. And so then, just like wet sand that has a footprint in it, pretty soon we return to what we were before, even keel and level. The pastor in such a church needs to know how to work with the central figure, not against them. I think it's I can't think of his name right now. Maxwell, John Maxwell. I remember a long time ago hearing this story that he told about being in a small church, and he noticed the paint was peeling on the front door, and he tried through every official channel possible to have somebody resolve to have that door painted and appoint somebody to do it. Didn't get anywhere for, I don't know, some length of time. And then he began to understand something of this dynamic, and so he asked to have a meeting with the key influencer at the church, and they met on the front steps, by the front steps, and walked in together. And as I'm sort of reimagining the story, but as they walked in the front door, Maxwell just kind of scraped some paint off and said, "Oh, look at that, it's peeling." And they went in, had their meeting about whatever the meeting was about, and a week later, he comes to the church, and the door has been sanded and painted. Right? That's how a key influencer works. And the pastor needs to know how to work with that central figure, not against them. And I've made the mistake, although I didn't understand at the time what that was all about. But I've made the mistake of trying to be a visionary when the patriarch was not comfortable with those changes. So pastors in these churches often get in trouble when, after a lot of people have complained to them about the key influencer, because people they do know what happens, and that person tends to always get their way. The pastor then believes it's their God-given role to stand up against this person. Now, a transitional minister has some opportunity to do that in ways that a called pastor can't, but they just shouldn't even do that. They almost always lose, or the church disintegrates, or there's some big problems that come out of that. Unfortunately, these are situations that cause me to feel like an ambulance chaser, because they tend to be situations that create work for specialized transitional ministers. So even the complainers, the ones who complain to the pastors, know that they have to deal with the matriarch or patriarch beyond the time of any particular pastor. And so what the pastor will find is that when he has that moment of challenging the power holder, believing there's at least a dozen people supporting him or her, they turn around and there's nobody there. And soon they're finding their suitcase. If the power held by this central figure is not helping the church grow or serve God well, and there's a recognition of this fact, then something needs to happen to change that. But it needs to happen in the rest of the family system. A benevolent or benign mutiny is what I've come to call that. And it's one solution. Hopefully, the power-holding person starts recognizing their unhealthy relationship with power and can make some changes. That would be the greatest option. But in other ways, the person just needs to be disempowered by others having some courage to not always go along with what this person says. Two stories here. One is that I was once enlisted to help out in a church. The main elder, what we call the chair, I phoned him because I'd heard that they were looking for somebody and I had some time I could help out for a bit. And in that first phone call, he hired me and he told me what my salary was. My dog is trying to seek my attention. No, lie down. Lie down. Yeah, that's more like it. So, and even at the end of the phone call, I needed work, so I didn't question too much. But I said, "Don't you need this to run this by the rest of the leadership?" And he said, "Oh no, they'll agree with me." And that should have been a red flag, and it proved to be true. I was the second pastor actually that this person had just directly hired on his own terms, and he was definitely a key influencer. He ran the whole show, and the rest of the leadership team just rubber stamped whatever he decided, and it was very, very dysfunctional. Um, so that's one of the ways it works. Um, Other ways that, like again, hopefully the power of the key power holder can be revealed back to them and their unhealthy relationship with that power. I mean, we always are positive that some of these things are possible, but you can also reveal it to the rest by once you begin to see how it gets flexed, I'll call it. And so I've had one situation where we were in a meeting of key leadership members, and a topic was being discussed that I could see was making the key influencer very uncomfortable. And suddenly, what the person did was just this, like that. And I watched as everyone stopped talking and nobody started a new sentence. And then after a few beats, started on another topic. And so, as the transitional minister, what I did was I said, anybody know what just happened there? We were in a good discussion on this and this and this, and suddenly we're over here. Did you see what happened? Now, what you do from there is it depends on the moment. But for me in that situation, two of the people present began to see how a vote could be cast just by one person clearing their throat and shifting their body position. A vote against the topic, even talking about the topic. That's an influencer at work. So those are some things that have to happen. A benevolent mutiny or a benign mutiny is a very tricky thing, because you can't be doing these things and claiming the power back as the rest of the church with resentment in your heart or bitterness or those kinds of things, but just a recognition that, hey, the church is more than just one person and one person's opinion, and it takes a certain amount of strength and assertiveness and risk to be able to, in kindness, in grace, express a different desire than the key power holder has. So if the family church does not grow in numbers, if the family church does grow in numbers, the further it gets beyond the 50 mark, the less influence the matriarch or patriarch can maintain. And they will likely not embrace this growth unless they have helped produce it, because then they can at least feel credit. And when the church gets to around 75 active members, again, not a hard line, but around there, the power now shifts to center around the pastor more. Because sociologically, in a group of 75 active members, there's going to be one or two or maybe even three. I've been in one situation where it was about that size, and there were 3 key influencers. And so what the pastor then becomes is the person who can manage the influencers and even bring them to agreement about something. And they, at least in a healthy, if this is done in a healthy way, not manipulatively, then the pastor starts to hold more of the influence and more of the power. But if the key influencer is not keen on their loss of influence as the church grows, it's going to be very, very hard to grow that church. There's also a point to remember in that if a search team calls a pastor who's perfect at the family church setting, so who's very good at cooperating with the key influencer, and who's very good at serving people in the capacity that they expect, then you can almost guarantee it's not going to ever get any bigger. So that's some thoughts about the family-sized church and how the size of the congregation systemically shapes the role the pastor can play. They're not the center. That's the key thing to know. And now I'll move to the next one, the pastoral sized church, and talk about some of its unique distinctives.